Good morning. Today, Pastor Peter Chin will share the message from the book of Genesis, chapter 45, verses 4 through 10. I will read in English, and my dad Ming will read in Cantonese. You can follow along starting on page 33 in the Pew Bibles in front of you, or on the screen above. Hear the word of the Lord. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When he had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance."
約翰叫他們走近一點，等他們靠近了，便說：我是你們賣到埃及的弟弟約翰。現在你們不要因為把我賣到這裏而自怨自責。上帝差我先來這裏，是為了保存大家的性命。地上的饑荒已經2年了，我們還有5年不能種，不能收。上帝差我先來，要為你們保留後代，又要大施溺救，保存你們的性命。
So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have.'
這樣看來，不是你們，是上帝把我送到這裏的，使他我成為法老的宰相，管理他的家和整個埃及。你們快回去告訴父親，他兒子約翰說：上帝已經使我管理整個埃及，請他立刻來到這裏。他可以帶着他的兒子、牛羊及一切所有住在歌散，那裏離我很近。This is the word of the Lord.
All right, good morning, everyone. Before I get into the message this morning, I thought we could do some seasonal announcements. Today is the Lunar New Year, so happy Lunar New Year to everyone. Sometimes people call it Chinese New Year, but a lot of different cultures celebrate this day, including Koreans like myself. In Korean culture, we actually go to our elders and we say something to them. Either you can do it on January 1st, but also during Lunar New Year, where you say, "새해 복 많이 받으세요." That's one of the few things I can say in Korean. Don't ask me anything else. And basically it means that we want you to have New Year's blessings. And children will kind of bow to their parents as a sign of respect. And then after you say that, you get money. That's what I remember, the money part. So any elders out there, you just make checks out to me and that'll be just fine. But we celebrate that. A lot of Vietnamese cultures, Chinese culture, Korean cultures, all throughout that area celebrate the Lunar New Year. So it's good to do that together. Also, starting next week, it's also Black History Month as well. So we want to celebrate that a little more intentionally this year. To help kick that off, next week we have some special guests who will be with us leading our worship. Foxy Davison, if you remember, she's been here several times, an amazing worship leader. She'll be leading worship for us that morning. And her husband, Jason Davidson, who is also a good friend of our church, has been here many times, will be sharing the message with us. And then all throughout the rest of the month, we have leaders from within our church sharing the message. We have our sister Leonetta, who will be sharing her very first sermon here at the church. And then Pastor Rob Daniels, and then our sister Romanita Hairston will all be leading and giving the message, which we're really excited about. And then in the middle of the month, we are hosting a very special event, which is the annual gospel concert, which is an amazing gospel concert. I've gone a couple times in a row. It is probably one of the best musical things that I've seen here in Seattle. And it also goes to benefit families that are affected by sickle cell anemia, which really disproportionately affects the African American community. So it's a great way for us to help out and to serve for that community as well. And so it should be a really fun month, and I'm really excited about it, not least of which being that I'm not preaching for that month. So I get the entire month off. I don't know what I'm going to do with myself, but it's going to be good. But I'm not done yet. I've got to focus because I have one more to go before that happens. And we have been talking this month, in the month of January, about family, and be looking at the stories of Jacob to help explore that, to help us understand family dynamics, but also to shed the light of faith onto them, to get some hope about how we can look at our families. And I think we've done that, but even as we've done that, I've still spoken to people who still feel pretty hopeless about their family situation. They still feel like, it's nice to know these things, but there's too much drama and conflict. I don't know how to handle this. And it just doesn't feel like there's no silver lining to what they're experiencing. And I think in light of that, it's good to move forward a little bit in the story and then to think about Joseph's life, because Joseph's life, I think, mirrors that idea or that reality, that it feels very familiar if we feel hopeless about our family situation. And to summarize Joseph's life, if you don't know it, he was sold into slavery by his own brothers, and even that was a compromise. Now, they wanted to kill him, but instead they strip him naked and they sell him into slavery to people who are traveling nearby. And then he's a slave in Egypt, and while he's there, he's actually gained some prominence until he's falsely accused of a crime, and he's imprisoned in Egyptian jail instead. And there, he actually helps some people who are in jail with him, but they completely forget about him, and then he languishes in that jail, unjustly there for over 10 years, for over a decade. And all of this is because of his family, because of his father's unfairness, because of his father's way of treating his family, but also because of his brother's jealousy. And so here we have a terrible story of family circumstance. It doesn't really get much worse than what we read in Joseph's life. And yet the way that Joseph sees his circumstances is very different. He's not overcome with bitterness or vengeance towards his family. Instead, what we read today in verse 7 through 9 is this. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God set me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God set me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So just think about his attitude here. He has been mistreated in a terrible way, in a traumatic way for years and years. He spent 10 years in jail for something he's never done. He's been sold into slavery by his own brothers. But his mentality, he has this incredible perspective where he's not bitter. He's not full of vengeance. Instead, he's comforting his own brothers. And the reason he's able to have such incredible perspective is because he is convinced that God has done something greater. He's convinced that God has actually done something good out of his circumstances, even out of the broken family situation that he has experienced. And I think this is just a reminder and an encouragement and a challenge to all of us that no matter how hard things are in our families, that Joseph's story is a reminder that as terrible as our family circumstances might be, God can still accomplish something even greater through them. And it's a very difficult thing to believe and to take to heart when we're in the middle of a really difficult family situation. But Joseph's story is an illustration and a reminder to us that God is still able to work good even in the most broken of family situations, like Joseph's. It doesn't get more broken than what we read in Joseph's life. And yet God is able to accomplish incredible good through his family situation, and that good transforms how Joseph sees his own life as a result. It gives him tremendous perspective. And so I hope for all of us, whether we're in that situation now, or we have been in the past, or we're sometime in the future, that we take Joseph's story as an encouragement to us that God can still do amazingly good things, even in the most broken of family situations. What I think helps us to really internalize this and to see this is to understand what good are we talking about? What good can God possibly accomplish in situations like this, in broken family situations? And it really applies to any situation. It could be outside of our family as well. But for the purposes of our sermon, we're really focusing on family for now. So what can God accomplish in these kind of situations? Well, there are 4 things that we see God doing in Joseph's life that hopefully will give us a kind of heads up, or that we'll be aware of it and look out for those kind of same things in our own lives as well. The first thing that we can see God doing through our family situations is that God works to mature us and to refine our character through our family situations. This is the easiest to understand because we all already know this is true. How our family refine us and they mature us and they test us, and we all already see that and we already know that to be the case. But we see that especially clearly in Joseph's life. In the beginning of Joseph's life, the very first word of description for Joseph in Genesis chapter 37 is that he's telling on his brothers. He's basically giving a bad report of how they behave. That's the very first thing that we hear about Joseph. And then after that, it doesn't get very much better, because from that point on, what he's doing, he's flaunting this gift of insight and of just kind of knowing what God is going to do. He flaunts that to his brothers, but not just flaunting that he's gifted, he flaunts that he's going to be more powerful to them. And even does that to his own parents as well. And he kind of tells his parents, like, there's going to be a day where you're going to bow down to me. And his own father, who loves him and who dotes upon him and gives him special gifts, even his own father tells him, like, what is your problem? Why are you doing this? Don't you know that's not really appropriate? So that's the picture that we get of Joseph in Genesis 37. He's an arrogant, immature dreamer. And that's kind of what we see who he is. He's an annoying person in Genesis 37. But as the story progresses and his situation worsens, we see a really profound transformation take place in Joseph's life. For example, when he is falsely accused, he's seduced and falsely accused by Potiphar's wife in Genesis 39. This is his response to that seduction. He says, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" That's a very different person that we're hearing from in Genesis 37. He has this moral kind of foundation, this moral uprightness that we're hearing. Or when people are asking him to use this gift of interpretation that he has, think about what we read or we heard about in Genesis 37. But read in the future in Genesis 40, where he's talking to the people in jail, and he says, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Or even to the Pharaoh himself, this God king, when they ask him to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams, he says, "I cannot do it." Joseph replied to the Pharaoh, "But God will give Pharaoh the answers he desires." He's speaking with this sense of submission, with this sense of acknowledging that it is God who is in control. And when his brothers come and he recognizes his brother and he reveals himself to his brothers, he says this, "So then it was not you who sent me here, but God." The man who is speaking in Genesis 39 and onward is not the same man who is speaking in Genesis chapter 37. No longer is he this immature, kind of arrogant dreamer. We find a legitimate Old Testament prophet. He's speaking with the same kind of tone and the same authority and the same submission unto God as you would find with Elijah or Samuel. He is a different man in this situation. And so we see this growth that occurs in him through his family situations. His family situations, as terrible as they were, transformed him from being this arrogant dreamer into being a moral Old Testament prophet instead. And I think that's one thing that we can look out for in our own lives. In the broken family situations that we might be in the midst of, or we might see in the future, that God might be transforming you and refining and maturing your character. That through those things that are so difficult, He might actually be taking you from being this immature dreamer into a prophet instead. And that's not a small thing. We can't pay or go to school for that to happen. That's something that God alone is able to do. And that's something that we can look out for in our lives through our family situations. Another thing that God is able to accomplish through our family situations is that God can prove that He will always be close to us no matter what. He can prove that He will always be close to us no matter what. This past week, I was able to watch the movie Just Mercy with some of the folks from the 180 organization who do work in restorative justice with young people, giving them an alternative to the prosecution system. And it's a powerful movie, and I encourage you to watch it. But The heart of it is that there's a man who is falsely accused of murder and placed onto death row. And in fact, he's placed onto death row before his trial as a way to coerce him and a way to intimidate him into confessing to a crime that he had never committed. He's not even on trial, and they put him onto death row. And in death row, it's such a nightmarish experience. One of the inmates was relating how they could smell the electric chair, that the ventilation system made it possible. You could smell when the electric chair was being used, and just how there was trauma that came out of even short times of being on death row, and just how nightmarish it would have been. And when I was watching that, it made me think about Joseph, because Joseph's story is actually pretty parallel to that. He's falsely accused, he has not done anything wrong, and he's been placed in an Egyptian jail, which, probably was as bad, if not much worse, than what we would even find here today in the United States. And so Joseph's situation, like what you might read or see in the story Just Mercy, is terrible. This is the very worst thing that could happen to a person. To be punished for something you've never even done. To be sitting in that situation for something you know you're innocent of. And that's precisely where we find Joseph. This is the very worst kind of experience and situation that he could find himself in. But what we find being described when we look at Joseph's life is that we have this terrible situation that he is unjustly in. But in Genesis 39, this is how it is described. But while Joseph was there in this terrible prison for something he did not do at all, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So we find this really stark contrast, right? He is in the very worst thing you could possibly imagine, languishing in a jail for something he did not do. And yet at the very same time, God is with him. God is pouring out favor upon him and success. God is close to him in that space. And that is one of the things that God is doing in the midst of Joseph's life. He is proving beyond the shadow of doubt that nothing can blot or take God out of his life. Not even something like this. They might shut the prison doors, but God is still right there with him. And that is something that I think we can be on the lookout in broken situations, even in family situations where it seems there's no redemption, that maybe one of the things God is doing is he is saying unto us, see, nothing can separate me from you. Even this family situation that is so dark, that is so overwhelming, it cannot blot me out. It can't force me out of your life. That I can be just as close in that kind of situation. It is proof positive what we read in Romans chapter 8, where Paul writes, "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." That maybe that's one of the things that God is proving and demonstrating in your life. That through those broken situations, that even that is not greater than God's ability to be faithful. He is proving his faithfulness in your life. And that can be another thing that God accomplishes through our family situations. Another thing that God can do is that God can help us to leave destructive patterns behind once and for all. That through broken situations, God can help us to leave destructive patterns behind once and for all. We've explored Joseph's family and Jacob's family's life, and we've seen how broken it is. We've seen that on many different layers, right? We've seen how there's this terrible preferential treatment and unfairness. We see the jealousy. We see the bitterness. We see the desperation for love. We see people plotting against one another, even, selling people into slavery. This is a lot of baggage, family baggage. This is a lot of bad patterns that we see here. But we haven't even talked about the worst yet. And that's described in Genesis chapter 34, in the story about Dinah and the Shechemites. That story is truly terrible. In that story, it's basically the worst things in human nature all coming together. Dinah is one of Jacob's daughters, not one of Jacob's sons, one of Jacob's daughters. And a neighboring tribe, a man for a neighboring people, actually raped Dinah. And then they say, I want to marry this woman. What do I need to do to marry this woman? And the brothers of Dinah, they come up with a plan. And their plan is they say, well, what we do to mark that we are a different family and that we serve a different God, we become circumcised. All the males become circumcised. So if you want to marry our sister who you raped, you'll have to become circumcised as a result. And they say, okay, we'll do that. And so all the males of that family, the Shechemites, become circumcised. But as adults, that's incredibly painful. And so they're incapacitated. They can't do anything. It's basically surgery without any kind of medicine. And so as they're recuperating from this, two of the brothers take their swords and they systematically go through the Shechemites and they kill every male in that family. And then the rest of the family comes, the rest of the brothers come, and they loot all of their possessions. And then Jacob comes and he hears about this. And he says, what did you do? What person out there won't know about us? What will they think about us? What will they do to us since you've done this? And their reply to their father was, what would you have us do? Do you want your own daughter to be defiled and to live in dishonor her entire life? And that is the very lowest moment. That is what Joseph has lived into. We talk about, the selling into slavery and the betrayal there. It's much deeper and darker than that. This is the family that Joseph lives in. This is what he knows. This is the family history, the cultural DNA that's living behind this guy. We're not just talking about, they don't get along. We're talking about a family that out of vengeance would kill an entire family as a result. We often gloss over Genesis 34, but this is Joseph's life. This is what he knows. This is all that he knows. This is what he thinks families do. So we fast forward now, and we fast forward to the point where now Joseph, this man from this same family, is now viceroy of Egypt. He is the most powerful man in the most powerful empire of that time, barring the Pharaoh himself. And lo and behold, before him are who? The people who caused him all his pain. The people who stripped him naked and threw him into a well and then sold him into slavery, where he was then languishing in a prison. They are right before him. And he can destroy them. He could grind them under his foot. And no one would blink an eye. In fact, probably people would applaud him. And they would say, that's exactly what should happen. You should have done that. He has every right to do this. Every right morally and every right authority-wise to do exactly that. And think about where his family is. Think about what his family has done. Think about the unfairness. Think about the jealousy. Think about the pain that he has experienced. But instead, what do we find him saying in Genesis 45 but this? And now, brothers who have done me so wrong, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. He takes a different path. His family has only known vengeance and jealousy and bitterness, but he instead takes this very different path where at that moment where he had every right to punish his family, he offers them forgiveness, and more than forgiveness, comfort. He breaks from the pattern that his family has established, and he creates a new one for himself where he breaks free from it. And it's not just this one moment. It's not just this one moment where he has this kind of this upsurge, this welling up of generosity, because many years later, his father would die, and his brothers would become deathly afraid because they believed that the only thing preventing Joseph from killing them was their father. Out of respect for Jacob, he would not kill them. But even that, many years later, what we find in Genesis chapter 50 is that Joseph will say this, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children," and reassured them and spoke kindly to them. This breaking of the family history, of the family brokenness that he knew, the family generational curses that his family had continued to live out, he broke it once and for all because of all the things that he had gone through. That now his family and the generations would follow after him would have a different story because of Joseph. because of his ability to break free from the family situations and patterns that they had lived out. And maybe that's one of the good things that God wants to accomplish in you. That maybe one of the things that he is going to do is he's going to break you free from everything your family has lived out before. The good thing that he's going to accomplish is leaving bad things behind. Once and for all, that maybe your family has lived out a certain pattern of speaking and living and addiction, and through this situation that God wants to break that shackle once and for all. And that is something that we can look out for, a good thing that God accomplishes through our broken family situations. The final thing that we can look out for and see that God does is that through our family situation, God accomplishes good work that extends far beyond ourselves and even our lifetimes. Even our lifetimes. You know, there's a common expression that many of us know, which is, the best revenge is a life well lived. You've probably heard that expression before. And that's where we say, you know, if someone's done you wrong, all you have to do is just kind of live a good life, get a good job, be happy, have everything, and that kind of speaks to that person unto itself. That's the best revenge you can say to someone, is like, look at me. I've got it all, so you didn't do anything to me, clearly. And so we might expect that that would be the foundation of Joseph's peace and perspective. That he would say to his brothers, you know, don't be angry with yourself, don't be distressed, look at me. I mean, look at this, right? You're a shepherd, I am the viceroy of Egypt. You know, you've got a donkey, I've got a chariot. You know, you've got nothing, I am the most powerful man in Egypt. So just let's let it go, right? I've got it all. My personal situation has advanced so far that now I have perspective and peace. And we would suspect, if that were me, that's what I would say, but that's not what Joseph says. That's not the basis or the core of why he says that and why he has such a different perspective on the things that has occurred. We read it in the passage that we saw today because he keeps on repeating this one phrase over and over and over again. He says this, and now, don't be distressed and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here. Why? Because I have it all? Because my situation has changed? Because I'm living such a good life? He says, no, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save lives by a great deliverance. Even years later, when he continues to speak to his brothers, he says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. The saving of many lives. The foundation of Joseph's peace, and the reason he has such incredible perspective on the situations of his life is not about his life. It's about the other lives. It's not about his good, it's about the greater good. And the greater good that God accomplished is what gives him such perspective. It's recognizing that God was doing something through him to save that region from starvation and from famine. That's what gave him the ability in the moment where he sees his brothers to say, I forgive you, not just because of my situation, because the good of other people, the greater good that came out of this. What we should recognize is that perhaps the good that comes out of your situation is not just for you, but the greater good for your community, your family, and generations that will follow. We have a really hard time seeing this as Americans. We have an incredible blind spot to this idea because we are, I'm not saying this at any one particular person, but we as a culture are incredibly centered on self-fulfillment. On self-fulfillment, on self-actualization. That is one of the primary goals of our culture, is to become self-actualized, self-fulfilled, that we are achieving the things that we think we are destined to do and to accomplish and to see. And if we don't accomplish those things, we cannot help but to feel like we are not fulfilled. There's something desperately missing in our lives because we were never recognized for the things that we were doing and for our great accomplishments. This is a reminder that the good that we see in our lives, we may not ever actually see with our own eyes. You know, we'll be seeing this testimony in a few weeks, but we recorded the testimony of one of our congregation members, Kelly, and she was telling the testimony of her mother. And her mother had always wanted to be a teacher. That was her dream, that she might one day be a teacher. But because of where she lived, because of racism, because of family situations that made it so difficult to just kind of keep her head above water. She was never able to live into that dream. She was never able to be a teacher. And I think for many of us, we think, oh, that's terrible. What a tragedy. She wasn't able to live into her dream, and probably she would have been an amazing teacher. And so that story is a tragic story, I think, for many of us, until we look past that one generation to her daughter and to the rest of her family, and how Kelly was able to become an acclaimed teacher, and how Kelly is now on path to become a principal to raise up other teachers as well. That the good of her mother's life was not just about her life, it was about her children's life. And that is a good that comes out of what God does. It's not just the good that we see about my own life is doing better and I'm becoming self-actualized, that maybe you'll never see it actually. Maybe the good that God wants to accomplish, you'll never lay eyes on, like Moses never entering into the promised land. Maybe it's your children who will live a different life. Maybe it's your family that will have a different path. Maybe it's your community that will be broken free from something that they've always suffered from over and over and over again. And maybe the good that we should be looking for is the greater good. And not just our own personal good, not just our own advancement of our situation, but the good that happens beyond our own lifetime in our own sight. I hope that for some of us who do feel just incredibly hopeless about our situations, that our family situation seems so dark and desperate, it seems like there's no good that can come out of it. There's no perspective that we can find, that you'll look out for these things, that you will look out to see the same things that Joseph saw, that you'll see the maturing and refining of your character, that you would be being transformed from this immature dreamer into a prophet instead, that you would beyond the shadow of a doubt that God will always be with you, that He is as faithful as He says He is, that some of us might recognize that nothing can separate us from God, but that also God can help us to break patterns. Maybe God is breaking a pattern that your family has lived out, and this is the season that He'll break it. Or for some of us, that good will be someone else's good. It might be your neighbor's good. It might be your children's good. It might be your nephew's good. I don't know. But maybe it's a good outside of even yourself. But even if that's hard and it still feels like it's difficult to imagine God doing something good out of something that broken, it's good that we celebrate the Lord's Supper today. Because what better example do we have of God making something very, very good out of a broken thing than His body and His blood? I mean, we have the story of Joseph, of course, but we also have this sacrament. We have this sacrament that reminds us out of the most terrible, gruesome execution method of that time, we find life. And I hope that as we take this sacrament, for any of us who have a really hard time seeing redemption out of brokenness, that your hope would be restored. Your hope to see a restoration would be restored today. On the night Jesus was betrayed, in this time that He had with His disciples, He took the bread that He was given and He broke it, saying, "This bread is broken for each of you. Do this however often you eat of it in remembrance of me." And in the same way, after supper, He took the cup, saying, "This cup is a new covenant which is in my blood. Do this, however often you drink of it, in remembrance of me. For whenever we eat of this bread or we drink of this cup, we are celebrating the Lord's death until He comes again."